it's not a new concept. It's like a lot of things aren't new these days, but they're now super important when it comes to a world of AI. Now, the general theme here, I'm just going to put it up front. All the things that were generally good practices for you to do in data before are even better practices now. Because essentially, before we used to do all sorts of different patterns where we think about like medallion architecture, semantic layers, all sorts of different things, documentation, uh, all sorts of different practices we would do in order to make the data more accessible and understandable for individual humans only gets maximized when it comes to providing sort of an understanding and accessibility to AI. Because again, an AI is oftentimes, while it can reason and think, it doesn't always have necessarily all the same context, intuition that an individual human has. So oftentimes in reality, what happens is that when it comes to like data quality, semantics, we oftentimes in the past have been not prioritizing these things. We're like, well, like as long as we have access to the data, we'll figure it out as we go. And that's because the individual humans had intuition, and they can use that intuition to kind of fill in the gaps and piece things together as they went along. AI needs context. It needs understanding up front to really be effective and to be efficient and not cost you a whole lot of money. Um, but first, let's explain like sort of what a semantic layer is, sort of how semantic layers were used in the past, and what does that mean now? Okay, and how to think about it sort of in today's AI world. Okay, so when we think about a semantic layer, when it comes to data, we're just thinking about a layer that presents the data in a more usable way. Okay, basically using business terms, business logic, etc. Okay, so what happens is that you may have all sorts of raw data. Okay, so here we have raw data. Okay, and we'll just copy a couple more of those. And the idea is that this raw data came from different systems. A lot of times those systems would create all sorts of other like columns with like weird abbreviated names, or the data just didn't look like in a way that if I were to tell a business line analyst to go, hey, go run some analytics on this data, that they would look at it and be like, I don't know what this data is. So in this case, like this would be kind of what you would typically consider as your raw or bronze layer. Okay. And this whole like three-layer, this medallion architecture, this is not a new concept either. People have been sort of doing this sort of three-step curation of data for decades. So if you talk to like old database experts, they would do similar patterns in the past. Essentially, you start off with sort of the data just sort of as is, as it was originated. But again, that's not necessarily the way you want to use the data going forward when it comes to analytics. So first step, you're going to kind of want to just clean up the data, join data. Okay, so in this case, here we're gonna have, let's say, we'll just for shorthand, we'll call it just a silver data. When I say silver data, I just mean like it's been cleaned, it's been sort of modeled, like it's sort of more general usage, um, but not for like a specific use case, not for any specific purpose. So it's modeled, it's cleaned, it's checked, it's prepped. Okay, and then here you have your sort of your silver or staging layer. Okay, depending what vernacular you're talking about. Okay, but again, it's all the same concept. The idea is you took your raw data, you kind of cleaned it up. You might have joined some of the tables. Like if you're doing dimensional modeling, here's where you'd kind of, denormalize all that data and whatnot. So here you have nice, clean, denormalized, quality check data. Okay, the problem is like if I have an orders table, like I'm not doing oftentimes maybe a dashboard on all orders or all sales or all customers. There may be sort of specific use cases, and there's specific metrics that I'm going to use across these different data sets that you know um, that we're actually reporting out. Okay, and that's where you kind of get into what's called your gold layer. Okay, and in the past even referred to as your semantic layer, your gold, your production layer, your semantic layer. And the reason being is that again, semantics means meaning. Okay, so big deal back in the like let's say early 2000s was like semantic search, where basically it wasn't just the way search engines were working wasn't just trying to match the words in your search to words on a web page. Okay, but actually try to understand the meaning, thus semantic search. Okay, so whenever I think semantic, I mean I want to have understandable meaning. I think meaning. Okay, so in this case, we might curate something like, hey, here I have some customer data, um, and then maybe here's like, this is my sales table, and I might create something that's like March sales. Okay, and then the different columns now have different names that make it much more clear as to what they are. There's new columns that are calculated from the other columns that are normal business metrics, like maybe average sale per user. There's all this sort of like curation of data that applies certain business logic, or sort of like, hey, certain business metrics. So you might have a certain like metric for customer, that's something that you've designed in house, and that's based on all the data you have in your silver layer, and then you would kind of curate it here. Okay, but the idea is that this version of your data, okay, is a version of your data that satisfies a particular use case using business logic and business terminology. So it's semantic. I can look at this data set, I can go run a SQL query on this March sales and kind of be like, okay, I look at the column names, I know what this is, I know what these columns are, I know what this means. This like talks to me as a business analyst. It has meaning. Okay, cool. Then again, you might go, and then again, you might derive even more data sets from there. Okay, so again, then if we go, and I'm going way back here. Okay, so basically in the earliest stages, like the semantic layer really just meant like your gold data sets, the versions of your data that had the semantic meaning sort of infused inside of them. Okay, but then what happens is that a lot of times these sort of gold layer type data sets were things that people weren't necessarily things that were like independently curated. They were things that you would just kind of build you would just build a dashboard and define them in a specific dashboard. Okay, so then basically people were redefining these metrics, these particular sort of redefining this business logic, sometimes across multiple dashboards. So now you're having the same calculation across multiple dashboards in Tableau, and different teams who are using Tableau are creating the same. So then the BI tools were like, okay, well, there should only be one canonical definition of March sales and any particular sort of columns in that version of the data. So what they did is they built in your BI tools. So say this is a BI tool. They built a semantic layer sort of as a feature. Okay, so basically the idea here, this will be your semantic layer. And the idea is that you would define these things in here. Okay, so maybe I'll put this in here for a second. And this was fine. So this meant different teams working on different dashboards within the same BI tool wouldn't have to redefine the same metric again. So basically, you can now canonically define how a business understands March sales across every team without each team having to redefine March sales. So while that semantic view has business meaning, it's not being redefined, so you have consistency in the definition of that. Now, the problem with this is there might be other teams that are using like Power BI or Looker, so now each of them are then redefining that same. So now you end up back in the same problem where now it's not just different people using the same BI tool, but it's now different teams using different BI tools. Okay, so now each of these BI tools have a semantic layer, but you're redefining a lot of these metrics over and over again. So then you kind of get to nowadays where tools like Dremio, Cube, at scale, what they do is they give you the service of having a semantic layer that's external to the BI tool. So basically what they do is they say, okay, hey, how about this? We're going to give you a place to define these things, typically as like SQL views, okay, external. So now what happens is that each of these BI tools don't need to redefine this data set over and over again. Okay, and again, the beauty of having these sort of like gold semantic data sets is that they are data sets that someone who's looking at the business, again, a business line analyst, can look at the name of, look at the contents of, and kind of really understand what the role this particular data set plays in the business. because it has semantic naming of columns. It is sort of set up with sort of the way the business works. It has business understanding baked in. So it's not just cleaning up the data. Okay, it's not like silver data is like absent of business logic. The idea is just like, okay, just what are customers? What are orders? How do I put all this data to create a entity that is orders? But again, how do we think about orders specifically in certain business contexts? That gets infused in the semantic or gold layer. Okay, so the semantic layer as a product was born out of this need to create consistent definitions of these. Okay, and there's a couple different ways you do this. Like some people who are literally just doing raw silver gold, they're just materializing those semantic views by just creating a physical copy at each layer. Okay, here's where Dremio was. This is where a tool like Dremio becomes really different, because Dremio built a semantic layer into its product, and you could do this sort of raw silver gold type organizing of your data. But instead of doing physical copies, you could just define this as a view. So you say, hey, this is a SQL view on top of the raw data, and then you would create your gold or semantic views as views on top of that. Okay, and then Dremio would have a caching mechanism to cache those views for even better performance to your BI tools. Okay, that was sort of the original concept of Dremio having a semantic layer, and an original reason why you start seeing like semantic layer as a product, whether it's integrated into a platform like Dremio or sold as a sort of individual piece, which you see in tools like Cube, AtScale. There's a Python library called Boring Semantic Layer. Although that was actually, that came later, and that's more geared towards AI, and I'll come back to that. But the bottom line is that this was a way, and then Dremio Semantic Layer would track lots of other things. It didn't just track sort of the definition of the SQL, but it would track like the schema of the data set. It had a wiki attached where you can write Markdown to provide additional context on the data set. And originally this was all for human discoverability. So like if I were a human on Dremio, I could go look at a data set, look at the documentation of that data set, have a better understanding of it. I could use all of this to do search. Okay, Dremio also has semantic search, so it could actually search through the column names, through the documentation, whatnot, to help you discover data sets. So it was really meant for like human consumption. Okay, but AIs want this information too. Okay, and this is where we get into sort of the AI world. So now Dremio, trying to solve a different problem, has this really cool thing built in, the semantic layer. This semantic layer that has all this sort of useful information for understanding the data that is available. Now, in today's world, you have your semantic layer, and typically the pattern would be something like this. And actually, let me illustrate what happens without a semantic layer. So when you're using AI on your data semantic layer, this is some research done within Dremio that's actually pretty fascinating. Without a semantic layer, what's going to happen is that you're going to end up having much more sort of loops within the agentic workflow. Reason being is that the agent doesn't understand your data right away. So it's going to have to go through more attempts to kind of figure out what's going on with your data, what data that it wants. So again, think about LLM round trips, which means you're spending more of your your AI tokens with whatever provider you're using, whether it's OpenAI, Claude, whatnot. Okay, and then you're spending more queries, which means you're spending compute with your query engine. Okay, so without a semantic layer, you're seeing sort of like, again, several round trips. So you can see here, like on run 1, it was like 10 round trips, 22, 48, 48, 16. So overall, like 144 round trips across 5 prompts. Okay, now you add those same 5 prompts with a semantic layer that provides additional context up front. Well, you start seeing a lot less. Okay, 7, 11, 18, 24, 15. So all on each run, it took less round trips for the LLM to kind of get to the resulting, and also required it to run a lot less queries to get the right result. Okay, to accomplish the task that it was asked for. Now, what does this mean? This means you save money, okay, because you're spending less money on AI tokens, all those tokens that you're submitting that you got to pay for, compute when it comes to running queries. But on top of it, you're also saving time, okay, getting quicker time to insight, because you're not having to wait for, if you ever had an agent do anything and you're sitting there waiting for it to go through all these round trips, it takes a while, okay? So essentially, in solving this problem, you end up sort of achieving sort of this pattern. The idea is you have your data, and then generally on top of that data, you're going to want some sort of tool that can query the data. Okay, so we'll say your query engine. And on top of that, you want your semantic layer. Okay, now, and again, in the Dremio world, these are both integrated. Like the semantic layer is part of the query engine, so you get both in one. But the idea is that, in your semantic layer can be lots of different things. Like things get a lot more flexible in the AI world. It doesn't just have to be SQL views. It could just be like a bunch of markdowns you have sitting in a GitHub repo or on object storage that you've just curated. And then what you do is you have an MCP server on top. And the MCP server is programmed with the tools to know how to, one, retrieve the data from the query engine and how to retrieve context from the semantic layer. Okay, so the Dremio MCP server already has this functionality built in. Okay, the Dremio MCP server can run queries to Dremio and can also fetch context from the query from the semantic layer. Absent the semantic layer, what you would do is you'd have to build your own MCP server that knows how to talk to your query engine, and two, also knows how to fetch the proper context from whatever semantic layer you build. So again, imagine that you decide to just build a bunch of markdown files sitting in a GitHub repo or an S3. You would then have to write like tool calls that would then have to write out the logic of saying, okay, hey, go to S3, based on the table name, grab the markdown file that matches that table, write down, take all that markdown as text, feed it into the prompt. So that way the prompt has all that context on that data set. Okay. Dremio, again, every data set has a wiki. Every data set will receive its like schema information up front. Again, you can curate to those SQL views with those named columns without having to duplicate your data. So again, it can capture all that information directly from Dremio without having necessarily to have you having to create your own custom MCP server. I mean, there will still be reasons why you may still want another MCP server for other business processes, but for this particular pattern, Dremio kind of has it all packaged up for you. Okay, and then that MCP server will then connect to your client, which whether that's like Claude or ChatGPT or whatever. Okay, and then you'd be able to ask natural language queries, and again, you're going to get the benefits of that semantic layer because again, the thing that made it where end users didn't have to think about how to recalculate the same metrics is going to do the same thing for the AI. Now the AI knows what your metrics are because they can see them. They can see all these, in this case, SQL views that are defined with all these different business concepts and the schemas that reflect certain business metrics. Okay. And they can just kind of quickly understand sort of what's going on versus kind of having to think, hey, you would want this metric. Let me think about how I would calculate this metric to kind of get to the end result that you wanted, and then have to kind of figure out, hey, which data sets should I grab the pieces of this metric from, and kind of redesign the whole thing after several round trips. Okay, with a semantic layer, you're saying, okay, hey, I've already done some of the work for you, AI. Here's the work I've already done. I just need you to do the last mile. Okay, and the idea is in the world to maximize the use of AI, you don't want AI to do all the heavy lifting. You want to do the heavy lifting that you can reasonably do. That is especially any heavy lifting that's going to be repetitive. Again, defining sort of business concepts, business metrics, business data sets that are going to be used over and over again. That should be done up front, not by the AI. The AI, you want to do those novel things that are going to be done based on that particular question. So that way it doesn't have to redo it again. Okay. So again, with Dremio, this line blurs. And if you haven't already, you should head over to Dremio.com to try out the free trial. Let me see if I have that the button I can push. No, not when I pre-schedule. I'm still learning how to use Riverside FM a little bit to kind of see how all these features work. But yeah, no, I mean, basically, bottom line is head over to Dremio. Let me see if I can open up that window again. And all you have to do is go to dremio.com/get started. And you can get started today. Free 30-day trial, $400 in credits, and you can try out these features. You can actually see the built-in semantic layer and see how this all kind of fits together. So hopefully this helps you understand sort of what semantic layers are and why they matter. Again, in the past, when we're thinking of things like Tableau and Power BI, you're typically thinking like SQL views, sort of predefining rules of how something is calculated. Um, Nowadays, what a semantic layer can be a lot less structured. Again, it could literally just be a pile of markdowns. Dremio gives you the best of both worlds, where you have the wiki, which is markdown attached to each data set, along with sort of the actual SQL definition of each data set when you create your SQL views. So you maximize the value sort of both approaches, and you don't have to sit there and recreate the logic of how to retrieve data and which data from the semantic layer. Dremio's MCP server that is going to be automatically built into the platform. You get right away, just by having a Dremio project, will provide you all that functionality. So hopefully you guys all enjoyed that. I'll see you all later. Let me go end the live stream, and probably do another live stream tomorrow. So I'll see you all then. Have a great day and enjoy.